Everybody, it's your main man, Anthony Brogdon, coming at you strongly, strongest, with a nice lady on the channel today. She one of them Ph.D. type people. Real smart sister. She did that. She wrote that paper and they said, come on over here and be a PhD with us. You deserve this. And she said, yeah, I'm ready to rock and roll. And she does it under the auspices of Black history, too. She's very proficient. Let me tell you something. Did I say who I am? I'm Anthony Brogdon, the host of this Strong Inspirations, where I give it to you straight, no chaser, to intoxicate your mind through the people who come on the show. Not DUI, but to make you stagger. And you will stagger today with what she's got to tell you. Watch out. And so, like I say, hit the subscribe button. Hit the like button. There is no love button. Hit the notifications bell so you get a ding, a shock, a smoke signal, something to let you know there's new content. And let me tell you, my friends, what I have decided to do, because I have over 600 people who I've interviewed. I've been doing this over 4 years, is that I re-release the videos often because you didn't watch it. You watched some of them, but not all of them. And I want you to know what's on here. So when you hit the notifications bell, you're going to get something to let you know, and you're going to like what you see on Strong Inspiration. I promise you that. And tell somebody about us. Don't keep it to yourself. You walking around, let's say you're a young man and what have you, you watch the video and you see a nice young lady and you trying to figure out what to say, and you tell her, hey, let me tell you, I like Black history, and let me tell you what I know. And you got it on Strong Inspirations. And then she says, oh, well, you're a pretty intelligent young man, and you know what happens. But then you didn't tell her where you got it from. You kept it to yourself. Don't do that. It goes further when you tell people where we are here at Strong Inspirations. And I'm excited. I met this lady. I was in a beautiful town of Mount Bayou, Mississippi. And I was one of the speakers, as she was. And when she spoke, there was not a whisper in the crowd. We all just was like, what? And it was so good, so eloquently, so and all them leads that it came out. And I give you a couple of the other videos. I interviewed a lady just recently released this, where she was a sharecropper and lived, as she kept saying, on a plantation. And I kept saying, plantation, this ain't slavery. She said, but that's what we called it. And then later we just called it a farm. Watch that video. Watch the one that I did with the president of the Mount Bayou Museum, a guy by the name of Hermie Johnson. I've interviewed him 2-3 times talking about Mount Bayou. Watch those videos. Watch the one I did with a lady who is in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Black Wall Street. She talks about growing up in Tulsa and how really she was not taught what happened there among the educational system. And that happens so often. That's why we are here. So watch those, my friends. Get a copy of my book, Black Business Book, America's #1 Black business history book on the market. There are other books, but nothing like this one. I add no commentary, but I give you all these amazing facts from the first Black business owner to 1960 and the founding of Motown. And I tell you a little bit about each one and so much more in this book. It's available, and to hear where I am speaking, and I'm going across the country as I did with Mount Bayou, and there's more to come. And international too. I think I got one coming up in London, England. On my website, go to businessintheblack.net. Now, you hear me use this term strong a lot. It's my favorite word. I like strong. And in my world, strong stands for strength, tenacity, resilience, and a sense of oneness, nobility, and grace. And that is my introduction to the strong sister on the channel today. Come on, lady, introduce yourself. Let's get it on.
Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here, and thank you so much for having me. My name is Shennette Garrett-Scott, and I'm a historian, and I just try to bring to life these overlooked stories of Black women's labor and activism and their kind of economic power, their kind of search for economic justice. And so I teach now. I am the Paul and Deborah Gibbons Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies at Tulane. But before I entered academia many years ago, I used to work in the subprime mortgage industry. And that experience really opened up my eyes to how, finance can both empower and uplift, but that how it can also exploit. So that experience really kind of fueled my mission to uncover, more of these kind of long hidden stories about Black enterprise and resistance. So I am the author of
We're gonna get to all that. I don't
oh,
mean no disrespect, but I gotta
okay.
let my audience get to know you personally a little bit.
Oh,
So it's a little connection type thing. I do this with everybody. And so where were
mhm.
you born and raised?
I was born in Houston, but I was raised in Dallas, Texas. I like to say I'm the other Houston hottie. so
Okay.
but
Yeah.
yeah, I grew up really in Dallas. And we were talking a little bit about, before you mentioned your interview with the woman who was a sharecropper. And I said, I come from a family of sharecroppers. So it was really interesting for me, even to learn that, my mom, my aunts had all, done sharecropping. And it's really because I remember when I was, even by the time I was like 14, so this was like back in the, in the 80s, 1980s. We would go to my grandmother's house, and she still had they didn't have running water. They had like a pump. They still lived on a farm,
And
in
this
a
is the
town that
80s.
didn't, yeah, in the 80s, in a town that didn't have a stoplight.
What was the
In
name of the town?
It was called Rones Prairie, Texas. It's in Grimes County.
Primarily a black town, I guess all black town.
I don't think that it's an all black town, even though, there are some all black towns in Dallas. But I can say that when I did a little, digging in my family history, um, I did find that both my father's side and my mom's side pretty much stayed in Grimes County. In fact, I was able to go, all the way back to 1860, and there were always, Garrett's, who had been living in Grimes County, often on the same land. But but my family owned a little land, but it was really clear that they really came from a family of like people who probably lived and worked on the same plantations in which they were
Oh, is
enslaved
that right?
generation after generation
Okay,
after
we're
generation.
gonna go into that, but I gotta ask you. So, where you did you grow up in a black part, neighborhood of
Oh yeah,
Dallas and and
yes,
and
definitely.
and
And
that kind of thing?
yeah, anybody who's familiar with Dallas will know Oak Cliff. So I'm come from Oak Cliff, which
Oh,
is
okay.
yeah, a black
Now, okay.
part
How
of.
how did you become such an astute student?
Um, I really have to credit my mom, who passed away about 2 years ago. But my mom, I think my mom was a striver, and so she didn't want to grow up, as continuing to sharecrop. So she, took advantage of every kind of opportunity that she could, and she really tried to pass that on to us. And really one of her greatest gifts to me was one, her hard work ethic, but then also she taught me how to read really early when I was really, really young, like when I was like 3 years old. So I just really got into reading. I loved reading, and always, did well in school because I love the world of books. And
Yeah,
yeah, and so
I want to invest.
that was my foundation.
I want to investigate that. Okay, so let's say, and I've talked to people, and this is something I wonder. Say you grew up as she did, and your grandparents and stuff, sharecroppers. How
Mhm.
does somebody know there's a better way? What would you suspect? How does she know that there was something outside of what her her immediate environment?
You know, when you talked about the woman, I think you mentioned a person from Tulsa who didn't, that people in Tulsa and the school system, you know, didn't really, you know, teach them about what had happened and their long legacy. I think that would have been my mom, except that she probably, and it's weird, and now I'm kind of thinking about it, and you know, she passed away, and I didn't ever really get to ask her about that. But I imagine that probably television, or she got some inkling that life was better than on the, you know, little kind of isolated little
Yeah,
rural farm. They lived in a, you know, in a little trailer.
really.
On the farm, and she probably just got an inkling that that was, you know, a better life, and so she moved to the big city of Houston, which is where I was
Okay.
born. And
Yeah.
she also met my father, who was in the military, and so because he fought in the Vietnam War, and I think that she, you know, but that meeting, you know, him, this soldier who had been able to leave Grimes County and, you know, travel the world. I mean,
Yeah.
albeit,
Yeah.
you know, with a
Sure.
war, probably
Sure.
just made her feel that, you know, there was just something better out there, and it was just something that she, you know, she worked hard for, but she also like really, you know, implanted it in me and my brothers and my sister.
Well, growing up in Dallas, I never thought of it as a kid. Dallas was the South. I kind of thought it, you know what I mean? I just didn't, but Dallas, not Dallas, but
Well,
Houston, but
Texas, you
Texas
think,
in
because Texas
general.
is a little bit west, a little
Yeah,
south
it's a
of
little
Texas.
bit west, but they grew a
Yeah.
lot of cotton there.
Oh, yeah,
Do,
definitely.
do you know of the cotton and that industry in the small towns in Texas?
Oh yeah. And Texas also is like super important as when you, especially when you think about slavery, because during the Civil War, you know, it was, that was the far western frontier, and so you had a lot of enslavers who would move their enslaved people to Texas to hide them or keep them from falling into the hands of
Yeah,
the or the Confederate army. So during the war, you have this huge influx of, you know, African Americans there, but then also, you know, in the 30s, the 1830s, 1840s, Texas was the kind of also the new frontier. So you also had, you know, millions of enslaved people move from, you know, the old, you know, enslaved places of like Virginia, you know, tobacco, you know,
yes, yes,
Georgia into Texas, because there's all this land that of course was, you know, taken from the indigenous
yes,
um
yes,
uh and and uh to
yeah.
grow cotton. It was part, it was definitely part of the cotton kingdom.
Do you know where the plantation is in your family? Is that what you talked about?
Mhm.
Grimes? Is that
Mhm. It's
maybe
in
where
Grimes,
they were enslaved on?
Grimes County. So what I did, because well, you know, people who do their genealogy know that you, most African Americans hit that 1860 wall, because before 1860, from 1860 and before, you know, Black people weren't listed in the census, you know, by their names. They were listed only as the, you know, the, well, enslaved people as the property of their enslavers, and they were listed really by just their gender, maybe their color, and maybe an approximate age. And so when you get to 1860, you don't have, you can't look in the census and find names. You only see, you know, a man, woman, an approximate age, whether they're dark, light skinned, you know,
Mhm.
etc. So it was, my next phase was to identify some of the, well, I can have identified some of the large plantation holders there. And then the idea was to, what I'm sure people who do their genealogy know, you have to take what information about your family that you have and try to see if you can match up who might have been, you know, around 10 years
Right.
old or 12 years old or whatever the ages are, trying to, you know, figure out. But you know, it's such a challenge because families were, you know, ripped apart, you know, sold away from each other.
Right. Right.
But but I do know that there were some, you know, large, you know, plantation enslavers in Grimes County. And so my next phase is to start there, kind of thinking that you know, because these families stayed together, you know, on these parcels of land, that they probably stayed close to, those different criteria.
Being and back to you just a tad, being a smart person like you, um, why do you choose Black history as an angle? I mean, because when somebody, growing up, your parents say, okay, I want you to be lawyer, doctor. Those are the professions that they know they can see money being made from it.
Right.
But as
Mhm.
Black history, you have to question, or at least think of where's the money being made from it. And then
Mhm.
does that only lead to academia? And then that's why you chose that because you really wanted to express yourself in that way?
Mm, yeah, I was one of the first generations in our family to go to college. So when I first went to college right after high school, oh, my mom was definite. You need to major in something that makes money,
Yeah,
business,
right, right, right,
law,
right,
something like that. And I did. I was a business major, but it was that accounting class that pretty
right.
much made me feel like this is just isn't really for me. I just didn't really have a heart for it. But the other classes that I had to take, and actually it wasn't history so much, it was sociology. It was like sociology, English, those were some of my favorite classes. And the first time I went to college, I ended up switching, from business to sociology. And I did have to have a talk with my mom about like,
Right.
I was just like, Mom, this is just not for me. My heart isn't in it. But as a sociologist, I thought that, maybe I would go to law school. I thought that I would do like research, maybe get into like working in a nonprofit or in a kind of a public service capacity, and working for the government. So she was, she knew that I had a pretty good head on my shoulder,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and
Sure, sure.
I worked hard and was really committed. But like toward the end of my, when I was going to be a sociologist, I met my husband. I kind of, switched my focus to like building a family, but I always really missed um you know, learning and, being in an academic setting. And then of course, when I was working in the subprime mortgage industry, um, I was spending long hours. I mean, like 70 plus hour weeks. We would bring our and my husband also was in that industry. He was on the sales side, and I was kind of on the operations side. I've worked as an underwriter, a processor. I've also sold. I've worked in real estate. So, but we were working super long hours. We were bringing our kids up to the job, and it and I and what really was a change for me is I was seeing all these other people get really rich. I mean, they were buying their little back mansions, new shiny boats and motorcycles and cars, and here I was, my husband and I, we were, bringing our kids up to work with lunch and,
Yeah, I got you.
toys and games and, barely kind of, I mean, we were living a comfortable life, but, we
Yeah,
weren't able to travel and like really enjoy, all of these kind of, advantages that we were seeing all these other people make. And the other thing too is we were in the subprime mortgage industry. I worked for one of the first companies that ever offered these, worth more than your house kind of loans, these where you couldn't get just 100% of the value of your home, but you could get 120, 150, or more percent, these super
mm,
high interest rate loans. And I was seeing people, getting this money falling right back into debt. We were also then we were doing subprime mortgages, some of the shadiest, be honest, some of the shadiest, slipperiest kind of mortgages that you could think of. I mean, mortgages
yeah.
where we giving people 300,000 millions of dollars with, and all they had was on the application was their name, their address, and that's it. Nothing about their income.
Really?
I mean, it was wild. They were doing, drive-by appraisals. It was just, so I also was feeling really conflicted because on the one hand, during this period of the subprime mortgage kind of ascendance of that is when that's the first time that the majority of African Americans became homeowners, where more than 50% of African Americans finally were able to become homeowners. And
Let me stop you there. Was that something that was a good thing for Black people? On one hand, that they were able to, and if we can compare that to from a historical standpoint, that might be a period where it was a good thing for Black people. If you compare that to maybe other things that they did, homestead acts and so on and so forth.
Oh yeah, I think that people owning property, I mean, it's kind of as a hallmark of, the idea of building a Black nation within a nation, is the idea of, economically strong, Black communities that are able to pass on their wealth intergenerationally between generations. And so yes, you're right. It was has a good and a bad. So yes, I think that it was a great thing that African Americans were finally able to kind of reach a benchmark in terms of property ownership that was bringing them a little closer in line to white wealth. And I can say that that's one of the reasons that Black banks were like so important, because historically that was one of their charges, was not, I mean, of course, investing in Black business, but really their main goal was to help African Americans become property owners, to own land, to own their own homes, to be debt free and self-sufficient. And when you talked about the Homestead Act, back, past, shortly after the Civil War, that did allow some African Americans to purchase land, but African Americans have always had to struggle with this, kind of two steps, one step forward, two steps back. So the Homestead Act did give a few, African Americans, access to land. Of course, not nearly as much as immigrant and, whites were able to. And plus, many African Americans were forced into taking, kind of land that was, not seen as valuable, or,
swamp land, so on and so
yeah,
forth. Like what we talked about in
was
Mount
not,
Bright.
not wanted as much. And so, especially after the failure of the Freedmen's Bank, when you had, the wealth of tens of thousands of African Americans wiped out, well, really hundreds of thousands of their wealth wiped out, African Americans just really, understood that they had to kind of take control of their own kind of financial future. They needed to control their own institutions. And so they created Black banks, starting like in the late 1880s.
Let me stop you there. Is that a glorious time for Black people then, would you say, when you look back on history, the time that we began to really pool our monies together, invest in one another in the purchase of land?
Oh yeah, that was definitely a glorious, definitely a glorious time. In fact, my mentor, the woman who trained me when I was getting my PhD, when I went back to school the second time to get my PhD, and I got it in history, was Juliet Walker, who wrote the incredible book, The History of Black Business. I think it's Capitalism, Race, and Power. And she also wrote the Encyclopedia of Black Business History. And she was, I mean, it really still is like, the stalwart,
That's
person
right. She sure. I
of
had the
Black
chance to
business
meet her one
history.
day. Yeah, I
Yeah, and
did.
she calls that period from 1900 to 1930 the golden age of Black business, because it was in
1900. Yeah, I got you. I got
1900
you. I got you.
to 1930, to up to the Great Depression. She calls that the golden age, because that is when Black businesses flourished at a phenomenal rate. They were, African Americans had owned business as enslaved people, during the Civil War, during Reconstruction, but it was, at that point, particularly after the failure of Reconstruction, after the closure of the Freedmen's Bank, when passage of, Plessy and segregation, that so-called separate but equal, that African Americans, really leaned into self-determination. And so so they, when we talk about that good and the bad, so since African Americans were being segregated, in, cities and towns all across the country, they had this kind of concentrated market who needed every kind of service. And so you had these Black businesses that rose up to give them to everything: newspapers, barbershops, jewelry, stores, restaurants, hotels. When you think about a place like Mount Bayou, electric, making their own kind of electric power companies.
Right.
Yeah, so every kind of business, that an industry that you can imagine, African Americans had played some part in it, because they were creating these businesses and services to serve, their communities.
Let's go into this, and then this is going to lead more of our discussion. You've written a book, and one of the things you talked about, Maya Bayou, what was that? And we're gonna stay on that. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
So in
Yes. Okay.
my first book is more about banking, Black women in banking in particular. So I do mention Mount Bayou. Well, I really mention Mississippi, because Mississippi and Virginia were two places where Black banking just exploded. Whereas in some places, you think of a place like Atlanta, Atlanta had a couple of Black banks. And but places like Mississippi and Virginia, they had dozens of Black banks, in
Really?
their states. So I talk about Black banks in the first book. Now, in my new book that I just finished writing, which will be out in 2026, which is about Black enterprise, I do talk specifically about Mount Bayou. So Mount Bayou, we know, is a really special place because it was known as the jewel of the Delta.
Right. Right.
Presidents, people around the world highlighted Mount Bayou as an example of
Right.
what Black excellence and
Right.
self-determination could be. But I do also make the point that Mount Bayou was exceptional in some ways, but it was also typical. The same kind of drive and and work ethic and dreams about the future that people in Mount Bayou had, people in other Black communities had too, in Black towns as well as in those Black enclaves, those neighborhoods within cities. But Mount Bayou in particular is, in my new book, I really talk about it because I talk about its cotton seed oil mill, not cotton, yeah, oil mill. So I talk about it as
Let's
industry.
I want to go back to this, and it may go for your new book. What is a Black bank?
Mm.
In short, yeah. I mean, how does it start? In most instances, uh, they get chartered. People deposit money, and what services do they offer?
Mm-hmm. I define a Black bank as a bank where the majority of the board and the founders and the people who charter it are African American. I
Right.
do put in a couple of exceptions. Of course, I put in the Freedmen's Bank, because even though the Freedmen's Bank was not technically a Black bank, it was created and chartered by the federal government. In fact, it was the third federally chartered bank. So you had the First Bank of the United States, the Second Bank of the United States, and then you had the Freedmen's Bank.
Wow.
It had an all-white trustee board because at that time, Americans, not just Southerners, but Northerners too, just didn't they didn't understand Black ingenuity, Black genius. And so they thought that they had to teach African American people, how to save money, how to be thrifty, to kind of instill in them, a kind of enterprising spirit. But, that they were sorely misinformed and confused. But the Freedmen's Bank, even though it had an all white trustee board, the majority of the customers were Black, and it was chartered and in the charter it says this bank is created for the formerly enslaved people. Now the Freedmen's Bank did have some white people who participated in it, but about 92% of the people who deposited money in the Freedmen's Bank were Black people.
Right.
But really telling is that 95% of the loans that were
Yeah.
made from the Freedmen's Bank went to white people. So
Yeah.
so the Freedmen's Bank is, you know, many of us, some of us kind of classify it as kind of with you know, quotation marks, as a black bank, because black capital and wealth fueled that bank. You know, the modern day equivalent of billions of dollars of black wealth flowed through that bank from the time it opened in 1865 to the time that those white speculators and that white trustee board ran that bank, you know, into the ground in 1874. And so when you said, what does it take to start a black bank? It does take a charter. And usually these black, especially the early black banks, which I kind of specialize really in the earlier generation of black banks,
Let's
before,
talk about
you know,
those. Yeah.
before the Great Depression, is you also had, you know, some of the most respected, you know, individuals in the community who would serve on those boards. So you'd have religious leaders, educational leaders, business leaders, large farmers, landowners, were also serving on those boards. You had people who represented the working class folks, you know, people who were heads of unions and mutual aid societies. And I think that part of the reason that, so I say that to say that one of the handicaps from early black business banks was that they didn't, you know, black people didn't have you know, they had a long kind of entrepreneurial tradition, but they didn't have a lot of formal education and training in banking and finance, even though they had a lot of practical experience working
Right.
as informal
I
bank,
got you.
lending, you know, money, and managing, you know, plantations and businesses. And so these bank boards didn't have a lot of specific banking experience, but they had the kinds of connections and cultural capital that would attract and depositors to the bank and make people feel that they could trust, you know, entrust their money to these banks. And then the second thing I'll say, so I talked about the board. Another thing you do is you do have to fund the bank. You know, it has to meet certain kinds of state requirements to get chartered. And so you have a lot of investment. And now I would say that the people who are investing in these banks are just regular working class people. They are, you know, washer women, you know, porters, um, maids, you know, domestics, um, you know, mechanics, field, you know, workers, farmers.
Okay.
These are people who are, you know, buying, you know, dollar or two, whatever they can afford, you know, not a lot of shares, and they are building up the bank. And then regarding services, the kinds of services that they offer really become critical. So they offer typical services in a bank like checking and savings, but they really become important because, like I said, their mission is to create wealth for Black communities, to invest in Black businesses, to help people buy land, to buy homes. And so that is what ends up making them powerful for, of course, Black communities, but also dangerous to the kind of racist, white supremacist status quo. Because we, as you know, one way that you kind of keep people disempowered is by exploiting them financially, exploiting them financially. And so these Black banks, which most of them, so there were about 136 or so, 130 plus Black banks that were started from 1888 up to the Great Depression. And the huge majority of those banks were in the South. And in southern places, in places like Texas, Mississippi, Georgia, Virginia, South Carolina, those farmers and sharecroppers who had access to a Black bank were much more able to escape that crop lien system, that system that kept them in perpetual debt, that, you know, white landowners who were able to keep the land after the war.
Right.
And it's basically a new kind of slavery to the land. But where there were Black banks, and not just Black banks, but Black credit unions, Black building and loan associations, and other kinds of thrifts, these and insurance companies too, these sharecroppers and farmers had a chance to escape that system because these Black financial institutions were there to extend them credit, to give them
I
small
got you. I
loans.
love it. I love
So
it.
yeah, so they
Yes,
were
yes.
but again, I just really like to stress that Black banks were these powerful symbols of Black self-determination that had so much potential and had done so much work to raise, Black people out of poverty to create Black wealth. But that is
Yes.
exactly what made them so dangerous
Well,
to
you
fight
mentioned
power.
earlier that Mississippi and Virginia were probably the hotbeds.
Oh yeah.
Why do you think those states were?
Um, when we talked about what starts a bank, the other thing that I didn't mention was also violence, was that kind of white backlash. And I think that Virginia was a particular hotbed because even before the war, Richmond was the first Black Wall Street, Richmond, Virginia. And part of the reason is because of the nature of slavery there. So you had they also, they had tobacco, of course, that's what Virginia is known for, but they also had industry. They had iron factories, flour mills, and so you had enslaved people working in not just agriculture but industry. And then also in places like Norfolk, they have a shipping industry. So it was just a really diverse place, economically wise. So I think that's so Virginia kind of, starts from a foundation of Black people already being, really independent, having created communities. And so that's one reason that it's a hotbed. Mississippi, I have always argued that Mississippi, a lot of people think of Mississippi as a place, as of course a backwater. They think of the Black people in Mississippi as, kind of like laying down for the kind of violence and repression against them. But I beg to differ. I think
Okay.
that one of the reasons that the kind of racial violence in Mississippi was so high is precisely because Black people were always fighting back. They were
Love
always
it.
asserting that they were that they were not things, they weren't chattel, they were people, they were human beings. Everything they did flew in the face of Jim Crow logic, of racist logic. They were supposed to not be intelligent, to be more like beasts, to not be able to take care of
Right,
themselves.
right,
But
right.
here they were building, successful Black towns, building businesses, having huge farms and plantations of their own. So I think the violence that was directed toward the people, Black
Yeah,
Mississippians,
yeah.
was a response to, their enterprise and their ingenuity. And
Right.
in particular, one of the reasons I think that for Mississippi, a real catalyst was that the some people don't people may have kind of heard of the Indianola affair. It gets sometimes a little mention in history books, but there was this Black woman who was one of the first Black postmistresses, in the country. And here she was, the postmistress. She was over a post office in this little town of Indianola, Mississippi, which was a predominantly white town.
Okay.
And the racist, new governor of Mississippi, just couldn't stand that. And he really worked up this furor about how dare the good white people of Indianola in Sunflower County, take their mail from the paws of a negress, and so
Okay.
her life was threatened, so much so that she and her family had to, leave, escape under cover of night. They went to Birmingham to kind of hide out for a year. But when they got back, she and her husband, kind of gathered some of the top Black, business and civic leaders in Mississippi, and they said, "Look, we're going to build what Wayne Cox called these monuments of protest." So their response to Jim Crow, their response to the violence of lynching was, we are going to build Black businesses and Black banks. And so they created a bank, the Delta Penny Savings Bank, which was like the third bank in Mississippi. And then after that, in places like Jackson and other small towns, Black banks and insurance companies, and these big secret societies like the Masons, the Pythians, began to create these Black businesses. And so you have we always talk about Black Wall Streets. I use plural streets because concentration of Black people, you have,
sure, I agree.
Yeah, these areas where you have these, this flowering of Black business. In Jackson, it was Ferris Street. But also people forget that even in rural places, Mount Bayou being a Black town, but even in white towns, like places like Indianola, other places, on market days, you would have Black people flock to those places to do their shopping, to connect with each other. So they're not Black Wall Streets per se, but they were places where, but even in rural areas, you had Black people coming together around local Black businesses to do their shopping, to do their banking business, to greet each other, to strategize.
Let me ask you this. Now, to charter a bank, you had to get the approval of the white supremacists in the state government. Is that correct?
Yes, you did.
And was that always a big hurdle?
Yes. In some is at first it was not. In fact, the very first chartered Black bank, the True Reformers Bank in Richmond, was actually, in some ways, white people thought of it as a joke. So its founder, Reverend Brown, got the idea to form the bank. He already had, the True Reformers, which was this really successful secret society, a mutual aid society that had started in Richmond. And there was a lynching in 1887. And that in the aftermath of that lynching, the Black communities throughout Virginia were terrorized by white lynch mobs. And one of the reasons that they were targeted is because this True Reformers was so successful that they were worried, the whites were worried that, man, you have all these Black people, they're getting all this money, they may be planning, something like a coup or something. Right. To take over, like a rebellion of some sort. Right. And so they were trying to repress Black people, running them out of their homes, like I said, lynching and other kinds of, harassment. So Brown said, well, what we need, instead of keeping our money with these trusted individuals and our individual little, councils, our little societies, we need a bank. We need a central bank where we can all put our money together. So he saw that as protection. So of course, at that time in 1888, when he had this idea, you had to get a charter from the state government. Right. And so when Brown went to, the white men in power, they laughed in his face. They thought, what, you Negroes, of course they weren't that nice, want to start a bank. So they, kind of, ribbed each other, was like, haha, this is going to be funny. This is going to be a joke. Yeah, let's give them their little charter. And then we're going to sit back and watch them fail. But of course, 1888, the True Reformers Bank opens, and it becomes just a hub of Black businesses, because not only does it become this incredible, bank, one of the first to get, $1 million in deposits in like 19th and 20th century, early 20th century dollars. It also starts other businesses. It owns a timber farm. It opens a hotel, a newspaper.
I love it.
So it just takes off. And so, of course, the jokes on the white power structure. So I say that to say that, yes, it was it was, you did have to get these charters, but many whites thought that these banks were going to fail anyway.
I got you.
So,
Let me ask you this
so
question.
what? Just give them the charter because
Right.
they're going to fail. But as these banks proved to be successful, so by 1910, they
Right.
looked around and they were like, oh my gosh, there are nearly 100 black banks. They're threatening the crop lien system. These people are building homes, buying land, et cetera. We gotta put the kibosh on this. And so
Which leads to my next question.
yeah,
That's what happened to the bank in Mount Bayou.
right. They begin to
Then
use
tell us the story of how they closed that bank.
yeah, and actually how Mississippi is a really, sobering story because a place that at one point had 12 black banks, when you had some states that didn't even have one, they had
Right.
12, black banks. So they conspired to destroy these monuments of protest, these symbols of black empowerment, and they used the law to do that. Now I always have to stress, these were the kind of some of the first kind of colorblind laws. So the law didn't say we are going after black banks. The law, but the law was, even though it didn't mention race, it was applied in a way that targeted black banks in particular. So, for example, in Mississippi, they had hundreds, nearly 1,000, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of white banks. 12, about by the time the laws passed in the mid 19 teens, they had maybe about 10, black banks still standing. But the banking commissioner said, I have evidence that he said that I am not going to allow any of these black banks to pass, these new, banking inspections, but kind of like over my dead body. And
Okay.
so he targeted every black bank. He only and then his other bureaucrats, they only did a sampling of white banks. I'm not saying that black banks didn't need some kind of reform, but they were definitely put on the, a target put on their bank on their backs. And one of the things in Mississippi, that one of the kind of powers of this new law is that they could do these surprise inspections. So they didn't have to tell you they were coming. They would just show up with their bureaucrats and demand to see your books. So the bank in Mount Bayou, what the commissioner did with the strongest banks in Mount, so one was in Mount Bayou, the other one was that bank that was started by the Coxes in Indianola, the Delta Penny Savings Bank. Those were kind of the two most successful, strongest banks in Mississippi. And Charles Banks has started the bank in Mount Bayou. And so first they sent their, little minions to do their little surprise inspections, but the white bureaucrats kept coming back and they were like, there's nothing wrong with this bank. It's strong.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the books are
Get
great.
them, man, get them.
Now the law said that they were supposed to do maybe 2 inspections a year if you were quote unquote lucky enough to get an inspection. But remember, every black bank he inspected, and they were at most 2 times a year these people would come.
Right. Yeah,
sure. So when these bureaucrats would go back and they would tell Commissioner Love, that was his name, Commissioner Love, the bank is great, it's fine. He said, no, go back. So for Mount Bayou and Delta Penny, within like a 6 or 7 month period, they had several inspections, whereas most other banks might have had one in a whole year.
I got you.
And so they just could not find anything wrong. But in the fall of like it's 1915, Charles Banks, who was, Charles Banks was known as the kind of a financial wizard. And he was slated to speak at a National Negro Business League meeting, thousands of miles away. So when word reached white people that, well, Charles Banks is out of town, that the commissioner saw this as his opportunity. And so he sent his minions back to the Mound Bayou Bank. And, without Charles Banks being there, he kind of could run over, the people
Right,
that
right,
were in the
right.
bank. But really what they said was, yeah, these books are really great. They're in order, but they're based on Black assets, Black businesses, Black stock, Black homes, Black land. Well, we have decided that that's not equal to white assets, white land, white stock. So
Well,
we're going to just cut the value of these by half, just arbitrarily. They
right.
Black owned Black wealth. They basically just did not
Yes, I see what
really
you're
believe
saying.
it. Yeah. And
Yeah.
so and then they ordered the bank closed. They Banks wasn't there. Of course, they sent telegrams to him, but he couldn't get back there in time before they closed the bank. And the other thing I'll say, what was really powerful about closing, a bank like Mound Bayou and other banks in Mississippi, is that these banks had like a really, a close relationship to other Black businesses. So when the Mound Bayou Bank closed, the Masonic Benefit Fund could not pay its death benefits because they held their money there. The Taborians couldn't pay their death benefits. They couldn't pay their bills. They couldn't pay their, their salaries because their money was frozen by the state. And so it was a domino effect
Right, I
in
see what you're
the
saying.
area of these other important, kind of Black businesses. Now, the Mound Bayou Bank did eventually reopen, became the
Oh,
State
did it?
Bank of Mound Bayou, and the Delta Penny was able to survive and actually get the very first state Black bank to get a state, certificate. But they were the only two that ended up surviving. And then both of them ended, of course, during the before the Great Depression, because as we know, the Depression, when America catches a cold, Black people
Right,
catch
right,
the
right,
flu.
right, right,
So
right,
the Depression came early, and
right.
those banks ended in the late 1920s. But that's kind of
Now,
what happened now by you.
and what I was told is that immediately after they closed the bank, and I don't know if it was after the first time, the second one, the white bank down the street said, we got a special account for Black people and services and so on and so forth, and did a real good, heavy recruitment job.
Yeah, African Americans, that was also another kind of, not a weakness, but an issue with Black banks. Black banks could only pretty much have Black customers, even though the Delta Penny in Indianola did have some white landlords that, because they were a powerful bank that bank there. So Black banks could only kind of have Black customers. White banks could have Black and white,
Right, right,
customers.
right,
So yes, the bank in Cleveland, in nearby Cleveland, Mississippi,
right,
did do a drive, for Black people to put their money, to move the money that they had in Mound Bayou to their bank.
right,
But I also just want to, but Black people did, also bank at white banks as well. But the
right.
problem with white banks is that, very reminiscent of the Freedmen's Bank, many of those white banks, either of course they treated Black people abominably, made them come inside doors, wouldn't, um, um, serve them after white customers. But the really important thing is that many of these banks were deposit only when it came to Black people. So Black people could deposit their money there. They could maybe write a check, to pay their bills and their rent, but they couldn't get loans or credit.
I see
So
what you're saying.
you
Yeah,
have another situation where you have Black wealth that is flowing into white communities to
yeah.
fund to back white businesses, white, mortgages. It's another kind of theft of Black wealth.
Now that the book, the first book, do you have a copy of it? The one that talks about the
I
Black
I
banks?
I do, and
Yes, because we promote here, so we plug. Let's plug that book. Yes,
I do,
yes,
and yeah, the
yeah,
book, it's
yes.
Banking on Freedom: Black Women in U.S. Finance Before the New Deal. It's won a couple of awards. But in this book, you'll really learn about the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank and other, in some other banks. But the St. Luke's Penny Savings Bank was important in particular because it was the first bank that was founded, chartered, and led, presided over by a Black woman. And it
Where,
opened
and where was
to
that bank at?
it was in Richmond, Virginia.
Okay, that's the Maggie Lena Walker.
That's the Maggie Lena Walker bank, and that's
Oh,
her right
everybody, I
there
know
in the
something.
middle.
Yep, that's her
That's her.
picture there. Yes. Do you have a website? How do people follow
Oh,
you?
I do.
Yes.
I have a website for my book. It's called, which, but it
Yeah.
has stuff about me. It's called bankingonfreedom.com. And it has an excerpt from the book if you wanted to
Yes.
kind of check it
Yes.
out before. I'm
Yes.
actually going to put a link on there for a discount to buy the book. But it also has other stuff that I do. So some of my other speaking engagements, I talk about Juneteenth. I talk
Yes.
about the Freedmen's Bank. I talk about other banks. I talk about, Mississippi history, because I used to teach in Mississippi. So yeah,
Yes.
so you can go
Okay.
on to bankingonfreedom.com and check me out.
So in short, you a scholar on Black business banking in particular as your expertise. Let's call it.
Yes, yeah, I'm considered one of the, one of the top experts on Black business history,
Yes.
particularly Black banking and finance history and Black women's business history.
I love it. I love it. Okay, well, I know because of the hour, I'm gonna say that we're gonna have you come back on. I love to do it because I want you to talk about that lady that was huge in Mount Bayou.
Oh
Oh,
yes, the
that you
queen, who I
discussed
call
her.
the queen of the Delta,
Yeah, the queen.
Mary
We're gonna talk
Booth.
about her in
Yeah.
another occasion. Everybody, this is what we do here. Strong Inspirations. We get to the story because I knew I wanted, what it was the basis of, just by meeting her. But
Mhm.
and we got there so eloquently and expeditiously in some respects. You understood how the greatness of us, and so I'm gonna give you this last word in this guy. What is it when you tell this story? What does this mean to Black people? What should we get out of this?
Um, I would say that the message is that African Americans have a long tradition and legacy of enterprise, and self-determination. I mean, this notion that, we were kind of, docile and kind of just accepted the kinds of things that happened to us and the situations that we were put in is just, it's just not true. Black people were always fighting. We were always building businesses. We were always trying to build a world, that, to make the true promise of, of democracy and freedom, and for all, true. We've always held America to account, to fulfill its promises, not just to us as African Americans, but to all people.
There you go. That's the final word, everybody. Hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. There is no love button. Hit the notifications bell so you get notified when the videos come out, and tell somebody about Strong Inspirations. Don't just hit on that girl and don't tell her where you got the information from, like I spoke about earlier, or on that guy or anything else. Let them know it's right here, everybody. And to you, my sister, I say this and I mean this with all the sincerity. I want you to stay strong, stay safe, stay on your grind. I love who you've become out of Houston, Dallas, and wherever else you've traveled, spreading this message of our resiliency. It happened to you as you're the first to do what you've done in your educational background in your family and have taken it to the highest height. You didn't stop at bachelor, master. You went and got that Ph.D. And so we're so proud of you. We're going to talk again and let's set that up. With that, I'll say bye-bye. We out.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sure.